maybe the only way in a narcissistic relationship is to phone it in, right? Doing the right thing, feeling guilty, duty, responsibility. These are many of the things that keep people in or keep people continuing to engage with narcissistic relationships. So take a minute, pause the video if you have to. Write down what keeps you stuck in this relationship, in a narcissistic relationship. If you're watching this channel, I think it's safe to assume that you have at least one narcissistic relationship in your life that you can't fully get out of. You might have more than one, but take a minute, and you can choose more than, we can talk about all of them, but take a minute and write down the why. Why can't you get out of it? I don't suggest any exercise without doing it. And I reflected on the narcissistic relationships in my life I can't get out of. And the reasons for me were duty, obligation, as a means to be able to stay in touch with somebody else, professional reasons. So when I really boiled it down and I got to the core of it, it was really almost completely duty, obligation, some sense of responsibility, and some practical issues. And when you look back before this, the narcissistic relationships that you were in the past, there may have been other reasons that you were stuck in narcissistic relationships. But as you learn more, practice radical acceptance, see it clearly, address the trauma bonding, you still can't get rid of all of these relationships. And it can be useful to get at your personal why. And you know that these relationships are a challenge, especially if they've been around for a while and you can't get out of them easily. So in these relationships, you learn to phone it in. Frankly, gray rocking, yellow rocking, disengagement, they're all manifestations of phoning it in. And if you have ever had a job where you phoned it in, you know what it's about. It was just the paycheck and nothing more, you know. So if you're phoning it in, you kind of do the right things. You say please and thank you. You get a sandwich, you might grab them a sandwich too. You don't get into the passive-aggressive mud with them. You don't expect that they will change. You don't share anything with them. It is, in essence, kind of showing up in a relationship with all the feeling out of it. You really don't care. But you do it, maybe because you're a responsible person or because there's something else you want, right? You may not be antagonistic or sadistic or mean. You don't give them the silent treatment. You phone it in. It's words without music, right? It's showing up, but not being fully present. You talk with them about superficial things like the weather. You engage in superficial gestures like grabbing them a sandwich. You bring your famous casserole to the toxic family potluck, but you don't really give a shit if they like it or not. Sadly, phoning it in is the only way these relationships work, because few of us live in a world of luxury where we cut off all of these relationships. In most cases, the collateral losses would be too high. None of us are independently wealthy, and we can't afford to walk away from jobs or relationships where shared finances are a thing. People around you may actually think it looks odd. It sort of looks like a relationship or a family from the outside. You show up with the potluck dish, the gift. You drive them to the airport. You drive them to the doctor. You buy them the Secret Santa gift. You listen to them talk about the weather. You listen as they talk about how the plumber screwed them over. Most people are not observant enough to notice that nothing is coming back at you. You just listen. And you radically accepted, so you know it won't. You engage in the sort of showing up, but it's superficial. And sadly, since most people in the world only notice or care about the superficial dance of the relationship, did you send a thank you note? Did you do the check-in text? Did you drive them where they needed to be driven? And they don't really pay attention to the depth of it. To the outside world, your phoning it in may even look like a normal relationship. And that is to your advantage, because you may be phoning it in because of a larger systemic issue. Trying to support other people in the workplace or family system, or a culturally ingrained sense that you need to take care of someone in a narcissistic family system, but really, you don't give a damn about them. But, and just as all things narcissistic relationshipy, the news is not all good if you are phoning it in. Because the more time you have to spend in these phoned in relationships, it is in essence like living in a mildly dissociated state. Words without music, moving through the motions, doing the errand, listening to the banal conversation where they ask you nothing about yourself. You're basically an unpaid TaskRabbit, engaging in social graces like bringing them a coffee too when you do the coffee run, or picking them up, or driving them. All of these are motions, and they are rarely reciprocated. The more that these are your primary social relationships, and the less you get to live in the world of the not phoned in, the more you are living in a sense separated from yourself. And over time, this can mean you feel numb, depleted, apathetic, sad, and over time you may even feel empty and disconnected. Sure, there may be days in this phoned-in universe when the narcissistic person may actually be a little nicer than usual, or might even ask you about your day, or maybe even pick you up the coffee and get your order. Those days and the number of ways they show up are not reciprocal. They're just moments of good luck, like finding $1 in the street. That can't be a financial plan for you. The chronic phoning in that people have to do, the people who find themselves maintaining narcissistic relationships for all the reasons that people maintain them long after the confusion and trauma bonding and not understanding narcissism lifts. You get it, right? It's the stuff that's keeping you in might be minor children, money, legal stuff, duty, obligation, culture, health insurance, housing, immigration. While it is the only path forward, it does come with a cost. This is why having a few healthy relationships becomes so important. Relationships where it is reciprocal. You feel seen, valued, heard, where you have conversations where you can be yourself. Having those spaces in your life can make the phoning it in bearable. You can see it in a context. You recognize that it's not you, that the phoning it in is a survival strategy. That probably brings up some grief whenever you have to do it. And because that constant grief doesn't feel good, we get more and more numb as we do more and more phoning it in. But if we don't have some spaces in our lives that are mirrored and healthy, nor in an accurate way, then we find ourselves living in a detached, fragmented, and dissociated space, and relationships become robotic places where you do the so-called right thing, but it's no different than being a dutiful employee. The words without music, phone it in, show up the way the world expects you to, can mean that the world thinks that your relationship with a narcissistic person or a narcissistic system is fine. After all, you are doing the things. The narcissistic person will rarely notice the lack of closeness or reciprocity if their needs are being met, but you are losing pieces of yourself when this happens. Phoning it in is also tricky because the more you distance from yourself, the more numbed, the more distracted, you actually find yourself making mistakes. You forget things. You don't have attention in the same way. You misplace things. It affects your life, your work. And since survivors already doubt and question and devalue themselves, this only makes it worse. Obviously, the contrast to this, yelling and screaming and trying to get the narcissistic person to hear you or notice you, while I suppose that is an option, it is not only an exhausting option, it can feel very out of reach for people who are triggered by conflict and anger and rage. And it can also be destabilizing for other people in the environment. If you show strong emotion, it'll often mean that everyone thinks you're the problem, you're the rager, you're the one who's crazy, you're the one who's not regulated. And this chronic pursuit of conflict is not in most people's nature. This kind of fight often gets wrung out in narcissistic relationships, leaving our fawning, frozen selves robotically going through the motions. If you are phoning it in, you got to remember to do things like cultivating other healthy supports. And also have to remain aware that you are phoning it in, so you don't normalize phoning it in as a way to go through all of your relationships. It can become tricky when the phoning it in sort of breaches the dam, and we start finding ourselves phoning it in even in our healthy relationships. It's hard to turn on and off that dissociative numbness, and the more phoning it in we do, the greater the risk of this. You have to be aware you are doing it and why you are doing it, remaining present and in your body, being aware that it is strategic, less numbing, more intention, in a way that is self-affirming. I am not bringing my best self to this, but I am also going to continue to show up as a decent human being because that is who I am. Harness that fight in you so the phoning it in doesn't feel like phoning it in as much as it feels like you being strategic and being open-eyed about what this relationship is really about. This kind of awareness is tiring. Phoning it in a numb way can almost feel easier, but it is so important to recognize that the phoning it in of it all is you viewing this relationship in a larger, accurate, clear context. Perhaps of you showing up compassionately, even when it is not reciprocal, and a reminder that this relationship did not take your compassionate nature away from you. You're not expecting them, you're no longer expecting them to change or be better. And it's a way to maintain a regulated environment despite the tantruming and the selfishness and the thin-skinned reactivity of the narcissistic person in it. Or you're protecting other people in the environment who may not be able to have a strong voice, like your kids. After years of engaging with a narcissistic person and believing that it could change, certainly phoning it in is an improvement, but it still takes a toll on you. Obviously, the win is that if we could get it to a place where we don't have these relationships in our lives, but we don't live in that world. Just being aware that almost like too much of a good thing can harm us, too much of this strategy, phoning it in, can also take a toll. You have to do it if you can't get away from these relationships, but just be sure if you're doing it, keep the larger context in mind so you recognize that this is part of the larger landscape of radical acceptance. Hope that's helpful, and thanks again.